Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. We're so happy you could join us today. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Tamara Bingham-Noyes. I'm the Director of Business Development at Center for Change. I'm here with Dr. Heather Finley, who's going to present to us here shortly. We're so happy that you could be with us today. And we have just a couple of things that we want to do before we get going, and we won't take too much time. We want to give Dr. Finley as much time as possible to go through a whole lot of information. For those of you who maybe this is the first time that you're logging on to this particular series with Dr. Finley, parts 1 and 2 are on our website. If you'd like to go back and take a look at those, you're more than welcome. You don't have to have seen the other two in order to get great stuff out of number 3 and 4. But if you'd like to go back and look, you're more than welcome. It's on our website. Center for Change, just a little bit about our place. We are in Utah, just outside of Salt Lake City. We have inpatient, residential, partial, IOP, and outpatient in our Orem, Utah location. We have a Salt Lake City location for partial and IOP. We'll also have a Boise, Idaho location for partial and IOP. So you can find more information about us on our website at centerforchange.com. All right, let's get to some quick business so y'all know what's happening before we have Dr. Finley launch right in. A copy of the PowerPoint is in the handout section of the toolbar. So on your toolbar, you'll see a handout section. If you click on that, you'll see that there are 3 things there. There's a PowerPoint, there is the post test. I'll talk more about that in just a minute. And then there's also a list of references for all of Dr. Finley's presentations up to this point. So you're more than welcome to take a look at those. A copy of the post test, as I said, is also in that handout section. Keep in mind that this is just for reference only. You're more than welcome to look at it or download it throughout Dr. Finley's presentation. But in order to receive continuing education credit, you must take the test online. And I'll talk more about that in just a second. When I finish the webinar, an evaluation will pop up. This is a continuing education requirement for us. It's completely anonymous, so please feel free to be candid in that feedback. We then tabulate that feedback and send it to the CE approval entities. So if you would watch for that when I end the webinar, it will automatically pop up. If you're listening on your phone, obviously you won't be able to fill out the evaluation, but that's okay. You will still have an opportunity to participate and take the test in order to receive continuing education credit. And that will come about an hour after the webinar ends. You will receive a separate email from GoToWebinar. That's the same place that you got your confirmation email from. You'll get an email about an hour after the webinar ends. And in that email will be the link to take the online test. And again, you must take that test online in order to receive credit. And when you pass the test online, the continuing education certificate is automatically downloaded to your computer. So keep an eye out for that. If you don't see it right away, check your downloads file on your computer. It should be there. Okay, I think we're ready to launch. I keep calling her Dr. Finley because that's who she is, but she's also my friend. Heather's was an outreach specialist with Center for Change for a while. She's a private practice dietitian. She specializes in gut brain, all things gut brain as far as I'm concerned. She has an awesome Instagram account. It's at gutbrain.nutrition. I got that right, did I, Heather? Is that right? With the dot in the middle? Okay. You should follow her. I follow her. She posts great stuff. It's really informational and awesome information I think you all would appreciate. So keep an eye out for her Instagram. And I'll turn it over to you now, Heather. So give me just a second to get that going. Okay, it should be coming your way.
Okay.
You see the notification that says, yes, I'd like to be the presenter? Because I did send it your way. Okay, great.
It froze for a second.
Oh dear.
But, okay, can you see everything?
I see I see it, but I also see your screen, your background. There you go. Now it's perfect and you're ready to roll. I'm going to go ahead and pop out. I'll turn off my mic and my camera, but I'm right here. So if you need anything, holler. And it's all you. Here you go.
Okay. Awesome. Thanks so much, Tamara. Uh-oh, what happened? Hold on. Technical error. I'll try this again. Hopefully I didn't hit anything. Okay. Thank you so much, Tamara. I am very excited to be here, and we are kicking off part 3 of this gut instincts series. Like Tamara said, you do not have to have attended part 1 and 2. Part 1 and 2 obviously build on the foundation of what we're continuing to learn in part 3 and 4, but I'm hopeful that you'll still gain a lot of insight with part 3. This presentation in itself is a lot of research, and I'm going to do my best to get through all of this research. I may skip a couple slides for time's sake, but I have them there for your information, so you can go back and refer to them later. It's hard to choose what to put on here because there is so much. And then just as kind of a heads up, a lot of the practical application is going to come in part 4. So if you haven't registered for part 4, I would highly recommend doing that. That's where we're really going to get into how do we actually apply this to our patients? What is the best way to do this? And I'm definitely looking at all the questions that you guys are submitting and putting those in part 4 as well. So thank you so much for all the amazing questions. It has been so fun to read the feedback and read the questions, so I can continue to educate on this topic and make sure that I am teaching you guys all things gut-brain. So here we go. If you haven't been here the last 2 times, my name is Dr. Heather Finley. I am a registered dietitian. I've worked in various settings as a dietitian. I've worked in clinical settings, outpatient treatment. I now have a virtual private practice. Like Tamara mentioned, I had the pleasure of working at Center for Change for several years, and they are just fantastic. So I'm glad to be back in this capacity as well. And then I am a gut health expert. I focused a lot of my doctoral research on gut health, honestly, because of my own personal experience with digestive issues, but also because I felt like I kept getting stuck with clients. I felt like I was reaching a point with my clients and I was like, there's got to be something else. And so I really wanted to know what else I could do looking at this gut-brain connection and how it was affecting them and how I could better serve them. So here we are. So today we are going to talk a lot about trauma in the gut, trauma in various forms, bacterial diversity, and then get into some micronutrients and macronutrient talk. Some of it, hopefully you are a little bit familiar with, and if not, hopefully it's really insightful information to you. So if you haven't been here the last 2 times, just to kind of recap to set the stage of just refreshing what we've talked about. We've talked a lot about the gut and the brain, how they communicate through the vagus nerve, which is the nerve that connects them. It's a bidirectional pathway. Your gut talks to your brain and your brain talks to your gut constantly throughout the day. An example of this would be if I was nervous, maybe before giving this presentation, maybe I had a little bit of stomach cramping. That is a gut-brain reaction. We have them all day long, whether we know it or not, and I'm going to talk to you about that today, how actually past trauma can affect this gut-brain connection. So disruptions of the gut can lead to disruptions of the brain in various forms. We learned a lot in part 2 about how stress affects your gut motility, stomach acid production, and the overall bacterial diversity of your gut. Stress is key when optimizing our gut health, and not just stress of what we think about like, oh, I'm stressed, I have a presentation, or I'm stressed because work is really crazy. Stress of all forms. Stress from past trauma, stress from under eating, stress from over exercising, stress from any day-to-day thing that is filling up our stress bucket before we can actually empty it. The gut can influence all of our emotions, even our pain sensitivity, and can guide decisions on what we are eating or what we decide to do. And then the gut has its own nervous system. That is called the enteric nervous system, also known as the second brain. The immune cells that are in our gut are the largest component of your body's immune system. So in part 2, we touched on how your immune system actually is housed in your gut and affects so many other things in the body. We're going to get into that a little bit more today as well. We talked about how the lining of your gut has endocrine cells that have up to 20 different hormones, things like leptin and ghrelin that affect hunger, fullness, and appetite, as well as various other things, and how serotonin is stored in the gut as well, which is essential for gut motility. And really what I mean by that is the movement of food and waste through your intestines so you can have a bowel movement. So the big question that we've been asking is, if our gut's sole responsibility was just to digest food, why does it have all these signaling systems, and how are they affecting us on the day-to-day? So many gut signals that go up to the brain help with fullness, nausea, discomfort, well-being, and all these responses are sent back to the brain as gut reactions. So our gut-brain connection is so real and so powerful, and thankfully so useful in how we can think about treating mental health and especially eating disorders, as I know many of you attending, that is what you do. So lastly, I mentioned on the last presentation this graphic that I was sharing that showed how gut responses affect the stomach and the intestines. So I just decided to throw it in here so you could see it. This picture is from the book, The Mind-Gut Connection. It's on page 30. It may not be on page 30 if you have the actual physical copy of the book, but if you have the Kindle copy of the book, it's page 30. But I love this picture. This actually plays a lot into what we're talking about today. Any emotion on our face is reflected in our gut. Just like I explained earlier, if you're nervous about a big speech, you might be finding yourself running to the bathroom. Any type of emotion is going to be reflected in your gut. So for example, here we have fear. This is going to decrease stomach motility and increase intestinal motility, because if your body thinks it's being chased by a bear, it's not worried about digesting food. It's thinking, let's get this out. We have better things to do. Blood needs to go to the muscles. With anger, it's increasing stomach production, stomach acid production, and increasing gut function. And so going to affect motility on that end. And then sadness is going to affect this as well. So decrease stomach function and decrease gut function. So just kind of get you thinking about this. If you think about this and how our emotions are on our face affect our gut, think about all your patients that struggle with depression, anxiety, mood disorders, and how this is affecting their gut function when you're treating them. Okay, so just to start with a little bit of definition, I mentioned today we're talking about trauma. So I put a definition here of trauma, but trauma really can be so many different things. It can be physical trauma, maybe like a head trauma. It can be emotional trauma, it could be psychological trauma, sexual trauma, a traumatic event, natural disaster, unhealthy relationships, pandemic. I wish that there was, and I'm sure that there will be, a study on the incidence of gut disorders in 2020, because I know personally in my own practice, I've seen this, just the underlying stress and I would say trauma of the pandemic last year has affected people on so many levels, and it's showing up in our guts and in so many other things. So just be thinking about all these different types of traumas. We won't be able to get into all of these today, but there's a lot of different ways that we can experience trauma. And I know, especially with eating disorders, this is a common thing that is a past history for a lot of these clients. Okay, so just to kind of set the stage, there are several studies showing how early childhood trauma is linked to IBS, or irritable bowel syndrome, symptoms. The gut microbiome can indefinitely be impacted by intense or traumatic experiences due to the way that the gut and the brain communicate. So there's research showing how early trauma actually weakens the immune system, and remember, that's housed in your gut, due to the effects of ongoing stress, due to the effects of how maybe you don't feel stressed, but your nervous system is on high alert. Ongoing stress will impact your microbiome diversity, and what I mean by that is the gut bugs that are in your gut, all the different types of bacteria that we have in our gut. So a stressed out gut is a stressed out brain, and really any type of stress or trauma does increase demand on the adrenal glands, those little glands that sit on top of your kidneys, and it will impact digestion, metabolism, bacterial diversity, and even anxiety response. I'm sure you guys have seen this with the clients that you work with, but when someone is in fight or flight constantly, they might be hypervigilant. The littlest things freak them out, or the littlest things send them off. This is showing the fight or flight traumatic response. And if they're in that mode all day long, as you know from part 1 and 2, how this affects how you break down food and how you actually digest food. But this chronic adrenal demand is going to have lasting effects as well. So I have lots of studies on this. I've listed some of them here. There's lots in the references, and there's even more that we could get into if we had like a whole day seminar on this, but we're just gonna scrape the surface on some of these. So this is something that's interesting to you. I would definitely encourage you to go look into this. It's very, very interesting, and the research is coming out every single day. We need more of it, and so I'm excited even to just see what comes out in the next 2, 5, 10 years. So trauma and abuse have been reported in up to half of the adults with IBS, which is actually twice the prevalence of patients without IBS. That's a pretty significant difference. Trauma increases vulnerability to GI and mental health symptoms. And then a lot of these studies are on animals. We need more human studies. They have demonstrated that adversity-induced changes in the gut definitely influence neurological development. So there was a study that was done at Columbia, and it was the first study to really link the disruption of a child's microbiome that was triggered by early life adversity, and they actually linked it with what was going on in the brain. So I'm going to go to the next slide and talk a little bit more about that. So like I mentioned, trauma and abuse have been reported in half of adults with IBS. So this study had 115 children adopted from orphanages or foster care, either on or before 2 years old, and then 229 children raised by a biological caregiver. And the children with past caregiving disruptions showed higher levels of stomach aches, constipation, nausea, vomiting. So they collected stool samples, and they showed that the microbiomes of the early caregiving disruption group and the biological caregiver group were distinctly different. So children with increased diversity in the gut were the ones with biological parents. And they actually linked this to the prefrontal cortex and emotion regulation. So this was kind of the first study that really got everyone thinking like, what's going on here? How could this affect people? So they actually did a follow-up study on this, and they found that these GI symptoms were definitely associated with future anxiety, concurrent anxiety, and the children that had 2 stool samples and an fMRI brain study definitely had the children that had early adversity had lower counts of bacterial diversity. We'll get into bacterial diversity in a second and why that is important. But basically, this study just showed proof of concept that your gut microbiota can be altered by early experiences of adverse caregiving, and it affects bacterial diversity, which can then affect emotion networks in the brain. So maybe not all your patients have experienced this, But just thinking about this and maybe how it can translate to other traumas and of course other research that we have on this. So specific to trauma and abuse, there was a study that basically what they wanted to identify was if subgroups of IBS subjects had different gut composition. They wanted to know, is there an association between early life events and gut composition? And can they use gut composition to actually classify IBS symptoms? And then what is the relationship between gut composition? And what I mean by gut composition is bacterial diversity, gut makeup, what kind of bacteria is in someone's gut, and then any IBS related brain biomarkers. So here's a picture from this study. We'll get into in a second what firmicutes and bacteriodites are. Basically, there are two types of phyla of bacteria. But what I want you to see here is just the significant difference in the phyla. So the healthy controls definitely had a higher amount of bacteriodites, which is the phyla of bacteria that is really, really good for producing short-chain fatty acids, which are anti-inflammatory to the brain and to the body, whereas the IBS group had less. And what they determined from this study is that obviously we need more studies, but there is evidence for involvement of specific microbes that actually affect your gut function, your brain function. They did a survey looking at an emotional scale. So there was definitely brain-driven disturbances of the gut. And, you know, could these have a lasting effect? Are there epigenetic factors? And then the other thing that they pointed out in this study, and there are other studies on this, is that Clostridia, which is a strain of bacteria, was higher in IBS patients, and that actually has an effect on intestinal serotonin. And we know from last time how serotonin is so important for gut motility. So if someone's serotonin levels are low, they're typically more constipated and having trouble clearing their bowels every day. So just very interesting once you start looking into all of this, how these different bacteria are affecting our gut function, how they're actually then affecting our brain and emotions. And we definitely need to continue looking more into this. Studies on PTSD. So there are several studies. There's a lot of studies on veterans related to PTSD that you can look into. I'm not going to talk about many of them today, but as far as studies on bacterial diversity and PTSD, typically individuals with PTSD have lower levels of bacteria that are associated with inflammation, immune function, brain functioning, and behavior. So these gut bacteria that we need can strongly influence all these different systems in our body and can dysregulate our stress response or the HPA axis. So an imbalanced gut microbiota in early life can have a long-lasting impact and other physiological effects that can definitely make individuals more susceptible to develop PTSD after a traumatic event. So that's why, just kind of as a side note, I really think it's helpful when you're assessing a patient and you're getting to know them and their history, asking about these things, like, was there a disruption in your family early on? What happened to you as a child? Like, how are these things from an emotional standpoint and from a gut standpoint potentially affecting their stress response, affecting their bacteria in their gut, affecting their emotions, behavior, etc. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about physical trauma as well, because this is super interesting. So we know that alterations in the autonomic nervous system can definitely impact gut motility and peristalsis, or the movement of the gut. There is research showing that a traumatic brain injury will actually impact your intestinal microvilli within 6 hours. This was in a mice study And this is a cross-section showing basically before and after, like how quickly the gut lining was affected. And so showing just like the breakdown, how this can then affect the blood-brain barrier. I'm not going to talk much about this study, but there's actually studies on like concussions and how that affects the gut. There was actually a study at my alma mater at TCU where it was a concussion study, kind of looking at some of this, like supplementing with omega-3s. Super, super interesting. If you're interested in going down that rabbit hole, there's a lot of really cool research on it. So even traumatic brain injury can definitely impact the gut. I know from personal experience, just working with clients, I've had several clients that they've come to me and said, I never had digestive issues, and then I got in a car accident and all of a sudden I had terrible constipation or terrible gas or terrible diarrhea, and they're also super anxious, super depressed, or having other mood symptoms. And so again, making sure you ask your patients all these questions. How has their health been affected? One thing I like to do is just take like a full health timeline, like from birth till now, like what are some significant events that have happened to you that could have affected everything that's going on in your case. And oftentimes head trauma or physical trauma can actually be a part of it as well. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit to talk about why bacteria matter. So we talked in part 1 and part 2 about how you have about 2 to 5 pounds of actual bacteria living in your gut. You also have bacteria all over your body. So our microbiome is the sum of all of our bacteria. And then when we're talking about our gut, that's referred to as our gut microbiota. So the microbiota that are the bacteria that are housed in your gut. But that's where you have the most bacteria. But really, bacteria matter for so many different reasons. Our exposure to bacteria actually starts at birth. You are impacted by the diet that your mom had, and your real first inoculation to bacteria is at birth through the vaginal canal. We won't go down the rabbit hole of like vaginal birth versus C-section. There's definitely interesting research about that and like autoimmune diseases. And so if you want to take a look at that, you can. But vaginal birth, you're going through the vaginal canal, you're exposed to all that bacteria, and that is your first inoculation. Then if you're breastfed, you get immunoglobulins, which are so crucial for your gut lining to aid in the lining of the GI tract. And there's actually specific fibers in breast milk that prevent the overgrowth of bad bacteria in your gut. So your bacterial balance really starts, honestly, even before you were born, but really it starts at birth. And breast milk also contains live, active probiotic cultures that positively influence your body. And so really, like, again, take that full health timeline. Sometimes it is helpful to know, like, were you breastfed? Were you C-section? Were you born vaginally? Sometimes that can be helpful depending on what's going on with the patient. So I mentioned these earlier. I just want to mention these 2 phyla of bacteria. So in that study that I was talking about a little bit earlier, it was showing lower levels of Bacteroidetes and higher levels of Firmicutes when trauma was involved. So 2 of the major phyla of bacteria that we have are Bacteroidetes and Firmicutes. Bacteroidetes are the good guys. So these bacteria produce short-chain fatty acids. And just as kind of a refresher, short-chain fatty acids are a byproduct of your probiotic bugs eating prebiotics. And really, these Bacteroidetes need fiber to survive. Firmicutes are, quote unquote, the bad guys. So an increased ratio of these Firmicutes is associated with dysregulated metabolism, inflammation, pro-inflammatory cytokines. Everyone has both of these. You just want the good to outweigh the bad. And oftentimes we see with a lot of different disease states that the Firmicutes will outweigh the Bacteroidetes. So as far as bacterial diversity in the gut, the reason that we care about this and the reason that we want to have a lot of different types of bacteria in our gut is because they help with gastric emptying, they help with intestinal transit, and they help with the migrating motor complex. So if you remember from part 1 and 2, we talked about the migrating motor complex. That is the intestinal cleanup crew. It comes in and sweeps out anything in the intestines in between meals. Bacterial diversity actually helps your immune system, and it actually helps with mood. So the more diverse your gut microbiome, the better your mood is, the better your gastric emptying is, the better your digestion is. And we know that the #1 predictor of bacterial diversity in your gut is the diversity of foods that you eat. Of course, probiotic supplementation can help, and we're really going to dig into probiotics in the next part, part 4. But really the quickest way to change the gut is by eating a wide variety of foods. We know that from research, and I see that all the time in my clients, just as they actually are able to increase diversity in the foods that they're eating, things start working a lot better. And then as far as bacterial diversity and how it affects the brain, we know that bacterial diversity helps with neurotransmitter production. It actually helps to decrease anxiety. It helps with memory. It helps produce Bdnf, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And the brain functions better when bacteria is diverse in our gut, because the vagus nerve is communicating with our gut or with our brain all day long, sending happy messages up to our brain, and vice versa. So here's a little bit about bacterial diversity, specifically in anorexia. So again, we need a lot more research on this, so if anyone wants to do some, let me know. But we know that intestinal dysbiosis in anorexia is associated with mood. So this is one study. This is a picture from the study that they did, and that they show that there's a potential relationship between the intestinal microbiota and behavior of patients with anorexia. So restricting calorie intake definitely has a profound impact on the microbes in your gut. It helps with increasing your diversity when you're eating a wide variety of food. But what they found in the study is that the altered composition of the intestines can possibly impact behavior of a patient with anorexia, which just perpetuates the restriction of food. Higher amounts of bad bacteria sending messages up to the brain, which then becomes kind of a chicken or egg scenario a lot of times. And a lot of this is a chicken or egg scenario, but knowing that the bacteria in the gut is actually affecting a lot of the food restriction and can alter behavior with food. Here is another picture from the study. So studies definitely show this pattern of dysbiosis in clients with eating disorders. This is a really cool visual from one study that just kind of shows like the negative impact that the gut microbiota can have on all these things: neurotransmitters, lipopolysaccharides, those are inflammatory particles in the gut, and just how this can actually increase behaviors, it can increase stress, it can contribute to irregular feeding patterns, and it can decrease nutritional rehabilitation, which is obviously not the goal. This study specifically was on male rodents. We really need more research on females because of all the female hormones and how that would actually affect things as well. So the big challenge here is patient compliance, right? Like, how do we get patients to comply with consistent eating patterns and consistently getting diversity in their food, complying with nutritional rehabilitation. And then also a big challenge, I think that probably a lot of you experience too, is if you have a client who has gut symptoms as well, it's very hard to get someone to eat if they don't feel well and if they feel like food is just sitting in their stomach. That definitely just perpetuates the fear of eating even more. I know I see that all the time as well. And so how do we make this more comfortable for clients? How do we disrupt this and create consistent eating patterns, which as you all know, can present a challenge. So there was another study that showed that actually prebiotic supplement in an enteral tube feeding actually helped with some of this. So definitely more studies needing that we need to do on this, but that is super interesting as well. Like if you can get some prebiotic fiber into these clients, how can that actually affect the brain, the drive to eat, also making it more comfortable GI-wise as well. So here's a slide of everything that you guys already know. So eating disorder behaviors and then what the consequences are. So we know that typically caloric restriction is happening, carbohydrate restriction is often happening for the reason that most carbohydrates have fiber and carbohydrates break down to sugar. And a lot of these actually will increase digestive symptoms that they're having. So it's a negative feedback loop. They eat the food, they don't feel well, it further makes them not want to eat the food. And then we end up with decreased bacterial diversity and potentially restricted caloric intake. Specifically, sometimes restricting high fat foods, often over-exercise. We touched on that last time, like how over-exercise can actually increase stress, how that affects the gut, how that affects digestion, laxatives, purging. And so the consequences that we experience often, malnutrition, poor energy, impaired memory, hormone depletion, cortisol dysregulation or stress hormone dysregulation, and then lots of GI implications. So I know this can all be very confusing and frustrating because it can be really, really hard to figure out where to start and how do we work on all of this. And really, like, the first place to start is getting your client to eat enough calories and getting out of that fight or flight, which is where the combination of working with a dietitian and a therapist is really helpful. If a client is finally eating enough calories but still in a state of fight or flight, it's further just perpetuating this feedback loop of not digesting and absorbing food very well, having a lot of these GI symptoms, and we want to get out of that state. So just to kind of sum it up, what research is showing us as far as like trauma and eating disorders. So there's a lot of implications for picky eating, restrictive eating, mood disturbances, stress, increases dopamine, higher dopamine, lower serotonin, and we know how much we need serotonin for gut motility, moving things through. And like I mentioned earlier, we end up in this chicken or egg scenario a lot of like what happened first and where do we even start? And like I mentioned, we'll talk a lot about that in part 4. So just as kind of a refresh, I'm going to go through this really quick so we can get to some of the other stuff, but a great place to start is the vagus nerve. That's the superhighway between the brain and the gut. We've already gone through a lot of this, but this helps to dictate the rest and digest mode and the fight or flight mode. It tells the muscles of the stomach to contract. It pushes food into the small intestine, which is where you absorb most of the nutrients from your food. And so stimulation of the vagus nerve can help with gut motility. And as we discussed before, you can stimulate your vagus nerve with gargling, humming, or singing. And so this can be one strategy that you can actually implement with your clients if they're having significant GI discomfort, tell them to gargle while they're in the shower, or tell them to sing while they're in the shower, or hum while they're making dinner. And this can get their vagus nerve to innervate their digestive tract and help with actually digesting food and getting it where it needs to go. And then, as I mentioned earlier, Bdnf is another really important part of this. So this is the protein that works on growth, maintenance, and stability of neurons. And we know that low Bdnf in the hippocampus leads to depression and anxiety. There's actually really great research on the strain of L. plantarum, and I'll talk about this more in part 4, and how it actually upregulates Bdnf. But Bdnf in the brain preserves intestinal barrier function. And so if we can work on the brain and we can work on the gut and get them to work together, then everything goes better. So calming the brain, getting out of fight or flight, increasing Bdnf, and then also calming the gut, getting the gut to actually digest and absorb food, working on bacterial balance in the gut, and then looking at any predisposing factors that could affect gut diversity or gut function as well. So I mentioned this earlier, but the reason that I want to bring it up again is because if we think about bacterial diversity, we think about trauma and how it affects the gut, we think about our patients who have a lot of these things going on with restricted diets, their bacterial diversity is likely low, maybe not always, but likely low. So bacterial diversity is their probiotic bacteria. And some of the reason that the diversity in their gut could be low is because of the lack of prebiotics. These are the fermentable fibers that feed the bacteria. And then once these probiotic bugs eat these prebiotics, they produce postbiotics or short chain fatty acids, like I mentioned earlier. These are anti-inflammatory to the body. They are anti-inflammatory to the brain. They help with mood. They help with gut function. So if you think about the study earlier with the firmicutes being higher and the bacteroidetes being lower, we want more of these bacteria so that we can have more postbiotics. That's the end goal, because they pay us back by reducing inflammation in our body and in our brain to help with brain and gut function. So we don't need to get too caught up on this because most foods have both types of fiber. Most foods have insoluble and soluble fiber. And so you don't need to overthink this, but just to kind of classify these fibers to kind of set the stage for part 4. Insoluble fiber is the roughage. This is the fiber that basically passes through the colon, comes out into the stool. We don't digest it, and it sweeps the intestines. Soluble fiber, on the other hand, most soluble fiber is prebiotic, meaning that it feeds your good gut bacteria. And we as humans actually lack the enzymes to digest this. Our microbes in our gut actually digest this for us. So if someone has low levels of bacterial diversity, they have a harder time digesting fiber, which is why they probably restrict some of this food. It's not comfortable for them. They have a lot of bloating, they have a lot of gas, they have a lot of intestinal cramping if they can't eat this food comfortably. And it just starts this snowball effect of like, well, now I can't eat oats because they hurt my stomach, and now I can't eat this food because it hurts my stomach, and now I can't eat, all grains because they hurt my stomach, and now I can't eat all beans, and now I can't eat all nuts. And then by the time they're done with it, they have 5 foods left that they're eating because they're the only foods that they actually don't feel terrible after. So some of the physical sensations that your clients are probably experiencing are real in the fact that if their bacterial diversity in their gut is low, then they're going to have a really hard time digesting foods that have soluble fiber. So things that have soluble fiber, lots of vegetables, lots of fruits, lots of grains, lots of beans and nuts, and so a lot of the foods that our clients restrict. But when when you eat these types of foods, a feeding frenzy occurs. Your prebiotic bugs eat, or your probiotic bugs eat these fibers, and they pay us back with those short chain fatty acids that I mentioned earlier. They attract water, this type of fiber, it turns it into a gel, and it makes it easier for us to pass a fuller bowel movement. Okay, we're going to totally switch to micronutrients, and hopefully I can get through most of this, but we need micronutrients, and if we're kind of on the same topic of restrictive dieting and bacterial diversity, micronutrients are a part of that. If you're super restricted in what you eat, you're probably going to be pretty deficient in a lot of vitamins as well. And we need micronutrients for neurotransmitter support. If someone is stressed or has past trauma, you have an increased demand for a lot of these micronutrients. And two that I'm going to mention specifically in a second, impact digestion. And also your micronutrient needs are going to vary based on your lifestyle, based on your life cycle, life stage, and also hormones as well. So really, to sum it up, micronutrients definitely help with our digestive enzymes that actually help us to digest and absorb food. They help with healthy bowel function, they impact anxiety, and they are impacted by medication. So if someone is on a lot of medications, it actually can deplete micronutrients and maybe like fix one problem and cause another. So definitely something to think about. So magnesium, if I had to pick two favorite micronutrients, it would be magnesium and zinc, which is what I'm going to talk about today. I guess that's how you know you're a nerd, if you're thinking about what your favorite micronutrients are. But here we are. So magnesium is involved in 300 different enzyme pathways in the body. I would actually argue that this is probably higher, but 68% of Americans are deficient in magnesium. Magnesium actually crosses the blood-brain barrier to block stress hormones. It suppresses cortisol and adrenal output. We can get magnesium from a lot of foods: dark chocolate, my favorite, nuts, seeds, leafy greens, avocados, beets. It's known as the original chill pill, but we're depleting magnesium all day long. Even being up here giving this presentation, if I'm a little nervous, I'm depleting magnesium. We use magnesium to help us regulate so many different things in our body. And then next up is zinc. So zinc is so important because it helps our immune system, which is housed in our gut. It helps with hormone regulation and actually aids in stomach acid production. So if you think back to part one, where I talked a lot about stomach acid production, kind of showing that maybe most of our clients could have low stomach acid, affecting their symptoms and then maybe affecting the bacterial overgrowth or dysbiosis that they're experiencing. If someone is low in zinc, it's going to affect their stomach acid production. And there are studies that show chronic anxiety sufferers have higher copper and lower zinc. Copper and zinc work like this. So if you over supplement zinc, it's going to tank copper and vice versa. And then there's lots of foods that have zinc in them as well. I'm going to show you in a second just what zinc deficiency can look like and how that can actually translate to some of your patients. So zinc deficiency can occur a lot. These are some common things that can cause zinc deficiency: celiac disease, gut infections, stress, excessive exercise and sweating. I actually have an interesting story about this really quick. I had a client who came to me a couple years ago, and she was like, I've never had acne in my entire life. I've never been anxious in my entire life. And we were just kind of chatting. And then she told me that she was doing hot yoga every day, and not like warm yoga, like hot 100-something degree yoga. When you sweat a lot, you deplete a lot of zinc. She started supplementing with zinc, and I also told her to stop going to hot yoga so much, and it all went away. It was like the craziest thing I've ever seen in my life. And so maybe it's not always that miraculous, but that's just definitely something to think about too, like your clients who maybe are over exercising, sweating a lot, losing zinc. Vegetarianism can definitely cause low zinc if not executed appropriately, and then estrogen and birth control. So I'm going to skip this slide because I don't want to run out of time, but you can go back and look at it. So just to kind of show like some of the physical symptoms of zinc deficiency and how they are very similar to those of anorexia nervosa. Not saying that supplementing with zinc is going to completely like get someone out of anorexia. Obviously, there are a lot of other things involved, but if someone is zinc deficient, having a lot of trouble digesting food, having a lot of nausea and bloating, having insomnia and poor sleep, and really struggling to like even get over the hump of either starting recovery or continuing, something to think about that could make their refeeding process a lot more comfortable. I know a lot of treatment centers already do this and can make things a lot better for them. And then specifically to digestion, like I mentioned, zinc is so important for stomach acid production. If you don't have enough zinc and you don't have enough stomach acid, if your stomach is not acidic enough, anything that enters the mouth and goes down the digestive tract that can't be killed off by the very acidic environment of your stomach, or what should be very acidic, is going straight to your intestines. And so undigested food that is overgrowing or fermenting, causing this bacterial diversity problem of too much bad and too little good. Some of these things aren't so complicated. So looking at this and potentially thinking like, could this be part of what's going on with my client? And can I help them very easily, either adding in foods that have zinc or potentially supplementing with zinc? And then a little bit more about zinc and appetite. So zinc is required to metabolize cholecystokinin, which is a neuropeptide that decreases the rate of gastric emptying to promote satiety or fullness. So after a meal, anorexic patients show a peak of plasma CCK levels that are twice as normal. So if your CCK level is high, you're going to stay full for a very long time. And zinc can actually help with this. So clients that complain of food sitting in their stomach, feeling like it's a brick, that might be something to think about. This is just a really quick study, not a big one. We definitely need more, but basically what this study was looking at is anorexic patients that showed delayed sexual development, no menstrual periods, hair loss, skin abnormalities, and they gave them zinc. And after 6 months, they had improved in every area, including even improved level of depression, anxiety, and taste. So I like to make these little graphics just to kind of show like the perpetuating cycle of all of this. And then part 4, we'll talk about all the ways that we can break the cycle. So trauma or stress can definitely have gut implications, both on the bacterial diversity side, as well as how you're digesting and absorbing food. Digestion is impacted. That can then affect your microbial balance, and stress and anxiety, depression symptoms increase, and then the cycle can then just repeat. And like I mentioned earlier, you find your patients in this place where they are having really bad digestive symptoms, really bad anxiety, don't want to eat because they feel like it's going to make their symptoms worse. And as I mentioned earlier too, it probably does because of the lack of the ability to digest it well. And the hopeful part about this is that there's a lot of really great things that we can do about this to help our patients feel more comfortable, as well as just help with outcomes as well. So just to kind of sum it up, early life trauma can definitely increase risk for IBS symptoms. IBS symptoms can alter bacterial diversity in the gut. Like I mentioned earlier, the more diverse the gut, the better all the other symptoms are. And the quickest way to change bacterial diversity is through food, not supplements. So being able to increase diversity of food. Altered bacterial diversity impacts the brain and impacts mood, especially when we are consuming those prebiotic fibers that feed our probiotic bacteria that produce those postbiotics. And these impact mood, and it can actually impact eating behavior as well. So it is really important to assess for trauma, stress, other life circumstances that impact the gut, because sometimes this is a snowball effect. I didn't even get into the research on like intergenerational trauma and how that can show up like from 4 generations later. If you're interested in that, you should definitely look into it. There's really, really amazing research just showing how like some of this actually gets passed down. You know, the microbiome of your mom when you were born is affecting you, and it can just snowball down the road. So this is all so super fascinating, at least to me. I hope it is fascinating to you as well. Next up, April 20th. It is wrong on your slides. So just as an FYI, cross that out. It's actually April 20th, not the 22nd. So it's a Tuesday, not a Thursday. And part 4 is going to be the best part, because now that you have all of this background knowledge, you are going to learn how to actually apply this. We are going to go through bacterial diversity as far as like how we can increase diversity in food and helping to improve that. We're going to go over specific probiotic strains and how they affect the brain. And I am compiling all the amazing questions that you guys have submitted so I can cover those as well. So definitely excited for that one. If you haven't registered, you should. In the meantime, I hang out on Instagram a lot, so you're welcome to send me questions. Welcome to just come hang out with me on there. And I am going to turn it over to Tamara.
Thank you, Heather. Okay, I'm trying to do 2 things at once, so I apologize. I promise I'm here. Because of the time, I'm just going to do the housekeeping stuff first and then come back to the questions. So that if we go over the top of the hour and some people have to bail out for a session or whatever, they still will have the information they need about CEUs. So when I click end webinar, you'll see an evaluation pop up. That's a continuing education requirement for us. It's completely anonymous. So if you would take just a minute to fill out that evaluation, feel free to be candid, give us some feedback, that would be great. And then about an hour from now, or about an hour after I end the webinar, you'll receive a separate email from GoToWebinar with the link to take the online test. You must take the test online in order to receive credit. And when you pass it online, the CE certificate will automatically be downloaded to your computer. So take a look for it there. If you don't see it readily, check your downloads file. Okay, that being said, we have a bunch of questions, Heather, so we'll get to some, and then I know that you'll look at them also after, and you can address them next time, but we'll try and get through some. Okay. We had several questions about, well, let me back up. This one is, I have a patient who is wanting to test/measure her gut biome /diversity. Is this something that's available? If so, how is this done and what is measured?
Yeah, good question. There's a lot of tests that do this. I would just be weary of the companies. I mean, if you're on Instagram or Facebook or any internet browser, you've probably had ads for like, test your gut microbiome and blah, blah, blah. Most of them are not approved by the FDA. There are a couple that are. And so definitely just look into what test it is. I'll just kind of put it as a disclaimer. We still don't know what the perfect gut looks like. And there isn't a perfect gut microbiome. What we know is that there are certain bacteria that can predict certain things. And as I was saying earlier, like just the dysbiosis that can occur when there's too many bad and too little good. So, I mean, you can get it tested, but what I would say is don't have your patient get it tested and then not know what to do with it and just start like throwing things. They should work with someone to do that if that's something that they're interested in.
Great. What is your opinion on SSRIs and the effect on gut motility?
Yeah, a lot of my clients take SSRIs for gut motility specifically. There are supplements that do this as well, like specifically supplements that have 5-HTP in them. Again, you have to be careful on supplements because they're not regulated, but yeah, a lot of times GI doctors will prescribe SSRIs to increase gut motility.
This next question might be a whole presentation, so maybe you can just address a little bit and then we'll go from there. So this particular dietitian works with folks who've had gastric surgery, so bypass or the sleeve, and these clients are usually prescribed a low diet in fiber by limiting fresh vegetables, fruit, or even added fiber to keep bulk down in the gastric reduction area. How can I help these clients find ways to get adequate nutrition and gut supporting fiber? And what other resources are there to help these clients repair gut damage in addition to the trauma work we do? So that's a mouthful.
Yeah. Oh, man, that would be such a fun presentation. Fun fact, I actually used to work in a bariatric clinic until I realized that it was, yeah, not a great environment for me. But I experienced the same thing. Purees can be helpful, or I always tell people your gut is a muscle. So you can train your gut to tolerate these foods, just like you wouldn't go to the gym and lift the heaviest weights ever if you hadn't been in a year. Don't eat 6 cups of broccoli the first time you've eaten broccoli in a year. You might eat like 1 pureed piece of broccoli and like assess tolerance. So there's definitely ways to get fiber in, and maybe just looking at like some of the lower FODMAP soluble fibers to start that are going to be more tolerable. But yeah, that's a
loaded question. Thank you. You did great. Thank you. Okay, if a client shares that they do suffer from PTSD or has experienced a traumatic event, what next steps should an RD take in our nutrition counseling?
Yes. So if the next step, honestly, would be if the client is not working with a therapist to work on the nervous system piece of it, you're not going to get anywhere. I've had clients who have the best intentions. They do everything that I tell them, and then their nervous system is so active. They're in fight or flight. And so really, like, I would make sure that they are working with someone to get their brain out of fight or flight. I was actually talking to someone yesterday, and she's like, I'm having nightmares, like I'm waking up. She's had kind of a lot of trauma. And I was like, you really need to work on that first before you can really make any significant progress as far as nutrition is concerned. I mean, there's definitely things you can do on the nutrition side of things, but it's just going to take a lot longer if their nervous system is still very, very alert.
Thank you. When you were talking about zinc, Heather, there were tons of questions, but a significant number of them were about how do we test it? Can you get magnesium and zinc deficiency information from a basic blood test, or those kinds of things?
Yeah, so you can test it. A lot of times you don't need to. There's actually a test you can do with zinc. It's like an oral test. Where basically you see if you get a really bad taste in your mouth, it shows zinc deficiency or not. So that's one kind of like at-home way to do it. But yeah, you can get a blood test to test for both magnesium and zinc.
From the doctor?
Yeah.
From the doctor. Okay, great. Thank you. Along those same lines, can Dr. Finley recommend what type of zinc and magnesium she would recommend? I know you're going to talk a lot about that kind of stuff in part 4, but is there something you can address today?
Magnesium, I can't, because it's going to depend on the client. So I'll go through all of that on part 4. So like for someone who's constipated, you might need something stronger like magnesium oxide or magnesium citrate. For someone who's anxious, you might need something like magnesium glycinate because it crosses the blood-brain barrier. For someone with sleep issues, so there's so many forms of magnesium that it's hard to say. And then same thing with zinc, there's a lot of different forms. Like zinc acetate can be really helpful for gas. Zinc citrate is helpful for other things. So yeah, hard to say the exact form, but zinc citrate is typically a good form, and then as far as like not necessarily affecting bowel function, magnesium glycinate is a good option for anxious patients.
Thank you. Where can I study more about this topic? Will there be any program, certification, or course that you recommend on gut and health?
Yeah, I don't know. Hopefully someday soon.
Okay. Is there a way to increase a baby's bacteria biome if they're born via cesarean and or bottle fed?
Yeah. Yes, you can add probiotics to a bottle. There's lots of great infant probiotics out there. You definitely don't have to go crazy and like over probiotic them. Like you can have too much of a good thing, but there's great infant probiotics out there that you can do. And then this is something that's actually very popular like in everywhere else but America. But one thing that they've been doing with C-section babies is like basically like getting the bacteria from the vaginal canal and rubbing it all over the baby. So take from that what you want, but yeah.
Thank you. I'm not sure if this might be too general, but I'll throw it out there and then you let me know. What's your experience with ARFID and how trauma relates?
Yeah, I've definitely seen that as well. I mean, I think a lot of that can go back to the nervous system, and the nervous system then affecting the gut and gut bacterial diversity. So they all can be interconnected.
How do you decrease the discomfort clients experience when they eat fiber?
So like I mentioned earlier, going slow. So you're remembering your gut's a muscle. So you might have to go super, super slow, like 1 to 2 tablespoons of something at a time, depending on what it is. And then we'll talk in part 4 about like ways you can prepare things to make them easier to tolerate also, and just how to make it more comfortable for clients. But also making sure their bowels are moving every day is a good step. And like I mentioned earlier too, getting the body out of fight or flight. You're going to get stuck if someone is still, their nervous system is overactive and they're in a constant state of fight or flight. It's going to feel a lot like an uphill battle. And then you're going to be frustrated and the client's going to be frustrated. So
thank you. I think that's all we'll have time for today. But again, Dr. Finley will see all of the questions that you submitted, and she can address some of those in her presentation next time. So thank you again for joining us today, everyone. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy day, and we look forward to seeing you again next time. Take care.
thank you.